The crisis of the later Middle Ages. During the later Middle Ages, the last book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, inspired thousands of sermons and hundreds of religious tracts. The book of Revelation deals with visions of the end of the world, with disease, war, famine, and death. It was no wonder why this book of the Bible was so popular. During the 14th century, Europeans experienced a frightful series of shocks: economic dislocation, plague, war, social upheaval, increased crime and violence, and the failure of the Catholic Church. By the end of the 13th century, noticeable changes in weather patterns were occurring as Europe entered a period that has been called a Little Ice Age. A small drop in overall temperatures resulted in shortened growing seasons and disastrous weather conditions, including heavy storms and constant rain. Between 1315 and 1317, heavy rains in northern Europe destroyed harvests and caused serious food shortages, resulting in extreme hunger and starvation. Some historians estimate that famine killed 10% of the European population in the first 25 years of the 14th century. Europe had experienced a great increase in population in the Middle Ages. By 1300, Europe had reached the upper limit of its population, not in an absolute sense, but in the number of people who could be supported by existing agricultural production and technology. Adding to this great number, the number of poor appears to have increased considerably. With an absence of food, chronic malnutrition contributed to increased infant mortality, lower birth rates, and higher susceptibility to disease because malnourished people are less able to resist infection. This helps explain the high mortality of the Great Plague known as the Black Death. The Black Death of the mid 14th century was the most devastating natural disaster in European history, ravaging Europe and causing economic, social, political, and cultural upheaval. People were horrified by an evil force that they could not understand and by the subsequent breakdown of all normal human relations. Bubonic plague, which was the worst and which was the most common and most important form of plague in the diffusion of the Black Death, was spread by black rats, infected with fleas who were host to deadly bacterium Yersinia pestis. The plague took three forms: and bubonic, pneumonic, and in rare cases, septicemic. In the bubonic plague, the flea itself was the transmitter of the disease. The symptoms of the bubonic plague started with the growth of the size of a nut or an apple in the armpit, the groin, or the neck. This was a massive boil known as a bubo, which gave the disease its name and caused agonizing pain. The secondary state was the appearance of black spots or blotches caused by bleeding under the skin. Finally, the victim began to cough violently and spit blood. This stage, indicating the presence of millions of the bacteria, signaled the end, and death followed in 2 or 3 days. Bubonic plague usually had a death rate of 60% and was fatal within 5 to 10 days. The pneumonic plague was much more dangerous. It was an airborne pathogen spread through coughing. Its death rate was around 90 to 95% and was fatal within 3 days. The septicemic was extremely rare. It was spread through direct contact with the blood and usually had a death rate of near 99%. Its victims rarely made it through the day. The plague originated in Asia, brought by flea-infested rats who accompanied Mongol invaders into Central Asia in the late 13th century. From there, trading caravans brought the plague back to the Black Sea and later to Europe. The plague reached Europe in October of 1347, when Genoese merchants brought it back from the Black Sea and to the island of Sicily. It spread quickly, reaching southern Italy and southern France and Spain by the end of 1347. Usually, its spread followed commercial trade routes. In 1348, the plague spread through France and the Low Countries into Germany. By the end of the war, it had reached England, ravaging it by 1349. Then it spread to Northern Europe and Scandinavia by 1350. Russia and pockets of Eastern Europe were affected by 1351, although death rates in Eastern Europe never touched those of Western Central Europe. It's been estimated that European population declined by up to 50% between 1347 and 1351. Factor in a European population of 75 million, that's almost 38 million people dead in 4 years. Natural disasters of this magnitude, like the Great Plague, produce extreme psychological reactions. Knowing they could be dead in a matter of days, people began living for the moment. Some threw themselves with abandon into sexual and alcoholic orgies, Wealthy and powerful people bailed into their country estates. The attempt to explain the Black Death led to extreme sorts of behavior. To many people, the plague had either been sent by God as a punishment for humanity's sins or had been caused by the devil. Some resorted to extreme asceticism to cleanse themselves of sin and gain God's forgiveness. Such were the flagellants, whose movement became popular in 1348, especially in Germany. Groups of flagellants, both men and women, wandered from town to town, flogging themselves with whips to win the forgiveness of God, whom they believe had sent the plague to punish humans for their sinful ways. The flagellants attracted attention and created mass hysteria wherever they went. By the end of 1350, with the direction of the Catholic Church, most of the flagellant movements had been destroyed. An outbreak of anti-Semitism also accompanied the Black Death. Jews were accused of causing the plague by poisoning town wells. Although Jews were persecuted in Spain, the worst pogroms were carried out in Germany. In February of 1349, the Strasbourg Massacre. More than 60 major Jewish communities in Germany have been exterminated by 1351. Many Jews fled eastward to Russia and especially to Poland. Thus, Eastern Europe became home to many large Jewish communities. The population collapse of the 14th century had dire economic and social consequences. Economic dislocation was accompanied by social upheaval. During the population collapse, Europe experienced a serious labor shortage, and that caused a dramatic rise in the price of labor. Overall, the position of landlords continued to deteriorate during the 14th and 15th centuries. Peasants began to buy their freedom, which weakened the manorial system and feudalism. When the nobility tried to strengthen their position, peasant complaints became widespread and soon gave to rural revolts. In 1358, a peasant revolt known as the Jacquerie broke out in northern France. The destruction of the normal order by the Black Death and the economic dislocation were important, but this was added to by the ravages created by the Hundred Years' War. The English forces in France stole all the peasants' food, while the French forces, to try to starve the English, burned many of the peasant lands. Their anger was only made worse by growing class tensions. The outburst of peasant anger led to savage confrontations. Castles were burned and nobles were murdered. The Jacquerie failed, as the nobles closed ranks, savagely massacred the rebels, and ended the revolt. The English Revolt of 1381, or Wat Tyler's Rebellion, was the most prominent. It was a product not of desperation, but of growing power, the growing power of the English peasantry. In the 1370s, the English nobility began to try to reimpose feudalism, while the king imposed a flat tax on each adult member of the population. This action sparked widespread rebellion of townspeople and peasants led by a wealthy peasant named Wat Tyler. The rebels burned down the manor houses of aristocrats, lawyers, and government officials and murdered several important officials, including the Archbishop of Canterbury. After the peasants marched on London, the 15-year-old Richard II promised to accept their demands as if they returned home. They did, and he quickly changed his mind. With the assistance of the nobility, hundreds of the rebels were arrested. However, the poll tax was eliminated, and most of the rebels were actually pardoned. Other revolts, like the Ciompi in Florence, and another in Ghent, symbolized the growing unhappiness of the lower classes. In 1259, King Henry III of England had relinquished his claims to all French territories previously held by England, except for one relatively small possession known as Gascony. As Duke of Gascony, the English king pledged loyalty as a vassal to the French king. Eventually, this annoyed the later kings of England, who considered themselves peers of the French king. A dispute over the right of succession to the French throne also complicated the struggle between the French and the English. In the 14th century, the Capetian dynasty failed to produce a male heir for the first time in 400 years. King Edward III had a claim to the French throne as a close male relative. He was the grandson on his mother's side of King Philip IV. French practice, however, emphasized descent through the male line only, and a cousin of the Capetians, Philip, became King Philip VI. The immediate cause of war, however, was Gascony. In 1337, Edward III refused to do homage to Philip VI for Gascony. Philip responded by seizing the territory. Edward responded with a declaration of war.